Welcome, everyone. This is wonderful to have a full house for our first kickoff program for this winter series of book and author lunches. This is the 13th year that we have been doing this. Style today. Just a couple of announcements because I see some new faces out there. On March 3rd, the Friends are sponsoring a very special lunch program with Sandra Macy, who is a certified laughter coach. I think we're all going to know it's the time of year when everyone can use a few laughs, right? She's good. I saw her program in December at another library, and I'm really looking forward to having her here. I hope you'll all be able to come and laugh with us on March 3rd. And now some thanks. Thanks to Karen Baker for coming this morning and bringing the books from the Country Bookseller. All of these books will be available for sale and autographing after the program. Thanks to the Friends of the Library, in particular Julie Langer and Linda McDonald, who provided the desserts for today's lunch. Thanks to the Mirror Lake Community Church for funding this program. Thanks to Kate for accepting a much smaller stipend than she can command. And thanks to Max Ledoux for facilitating a pretty fraught email correspondence between us. And also for agreeing to introduce his friend to us this morning, Max.
If you don't know me already, my name is Max Ledoux. I live over on Durgan, and I'm a member of the History Book Club, which meets right here. And we're reading Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates this month, and that's next week, and you should come. It's very fun. Happy to introduce Kate to you. I'm not going to tell you her life story, because that's why she's here. But I will tell you just a little brief story, which is that the first time that Kate came to my house, she gave me this hat from the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and she said to me, when you visit somebody, go to their house, it's appropriate to give them a gift, which is very good advice. Kate also gave me another gift, which she didn't realize when she came that she was going to give, but when I asked for it, she gave it, which is, some of you may know or remember that there was a very unfortunate death in my house about 18 years ago before I lived there. And many of us here have experienced death, I imagine. I was in the room when my mother died many years ago. And you'll find that Kate is somebody who's experienced in death and also experienced in helping people who experience death. And so I asked her for a blessing. She's a minister, and she did give a blessing. I don't remember the exact words that she used. I just remember the comfort that those words brought me. So I think that what you'll find is that although she brought me a gift, Kate is in fact a gift. So very happy to have her here, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, it is true that I work around and with a lot of death and dying. Usually I am blessing the survivors, not the person who's died. But in that, I think in that time we did say a blessing for her. I actually have sort of two hats. And, well, I had three, I guess. And I'm happy to talk about either of these two jobs. So my day job kind of is to be a writer. And that is very interesting to do, and I hope that the product is interesting, but it's not actually that interesting to talk about. But my other job is to be the chaplain of the Maine Warden Service. And that is far and away the best job in ministry. I'm always afraid that someone more qualified is going to come along and take it from me. So far, knock wood, for 17 years, I've been able to hold on to it. So the chaplain of the Maine Warden Service position has existed for 18 years. I've been their chaplain for 17 years. And as of next week, it will be the first full-time paid chaplain position, probably in the United States, but certainly that they've ever had in Maine. So, yeah, which is actually a really good thing, mostly because it means I'm replaceable. So, well, there's always, when you start a job, when you create a job yourself, there's always this possibility that you're creating a job only you can fill. So if I were to get old, for example, or like too old to teeter into the woods with the Maine game warden, or if something else happened and I couldn't do it anymore, the worry was that they would have to then go and find another, minister with a uniform fetish to fill my place, and there aren't as many of those as you might imagine. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about that, but I thought what I would do is read a little bit from my newest book, which is Anchor and Flares. And I can also tell you that this person on the cover is my daughter Anne, known as Wooly, and she's 3 in that picture. She just completed her first week at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. So she came
She's not 3 anymore.
She's 25. She came home. I called me on her way home, and she said, "Mom," she said, "I had to do push-ups, and they screamed at me, and they made us get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and run around in the snow, and it was awesome." So anyway, I thought I would read a bit from this for you, and then now I'm going to be obsessing about this laughter coach, but anyway, that it will probably tell those of you who don't know anything about me a little bit about me, and then we can talk. So, when I was little, I wanted to be a boy. In those days, the 1960s and early 1970s, anyone who lacked a penis could not try out for Little League. Note to Freud, it wasn't the thing itself I envied, especially after the time my little brother got his stuck in a zipper. I just wanted to play ball. And I also wanted to be a cowboy and a policeman and a soldier. Or was it a combat correspondent like my father that I was pretending to be when I marched around the backyard in a little pair of fatigue pants? Then, at the age of 12, I read the seminal, or ovulatory, primer for the modern feminist movement, Sisterhood is Powerful, edited by Robin Morgan, and cured of what was a merely situational gender dysphoria, I picketed the White House, marched for the Equal Rights Amendment, and arraigned the nearest available man, my father, for all the crimes of patriarchy. What good are men anyway? I demanded in scornful summation. And Dad virtuously answered, men are here to protect women. To which I promptly retorted, well, but what are you protecting us from? Other men. If there were no men, there'd be no problem. And this might have hurt my father's feelings, except that he got a real kick out of his children's rhetorical flourishes. But my boy babies would wear pink and flowered clothing. My girls would play with trucks and get their Oshkosh Bagosh overalls dirty. And when I noticed that my kids' Playmobil playsets seemed to offer few obviously female people to play with, Drew, their father, and I spent a long evening switching the little plastic heads around on the bodies to create nurses in skirts with short hair and police officers with ponytails and eyelashes. And the 3 little pigs my kids heard about were named Marion, Adele, and Ermintrude. Little Red Riding Hood achieved victory over her nemesis in drag unaided, and it was a bored little shepherd girl who cried wolf. Perhaps I went too far when I informed my sons that at least 2 of the 4 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, statistically speaking, were probably female. They're all boys, Peter insisted furiously. They have boys' names. Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Donatello. Well, who named them? Splinter. That's the rat who adopted them after he found them in the sewers when they were babies. So you're telling me a rat knows how to sex a reptile? Any mention of him checking out their little turtle cloacae? My avowed motivation in this was to keep open as many imaginative doors as possible, though the only concrete result on this occasion was that the kids learned the word cloacae. Though I claim to desire maximum freedom as much for my sons as for my daughters, I'll now admit to another possibility. Absent deliberately non-sexist child rearing, would my dear little boys be in danger of growing up to be the limiters? Did I go so far as to imagine they might become agents of oppression? I hope not, but these were the 1980s after all, and people like me often spoke that way. Despite our best efforts, our sons demonstrated a few strangely gender-specific inclinations. They were given toy babies, but not toy weapons, but it didn't take them long to figure out that a Lego plowshare could be made into a Lego gun. All on their own, the boys stuck the little plastic blocks together into an approximate gun shape and then ran around the house, shrieking bang and feigning death. The perspicacious reader will point out that toy gun rule or no toy gun rule, the boy's father, Drew, a state trooper, carried a real gun every day to work. Whatever we might have said to our children, guns were as obvious a feature of the adult lives they sought to imitate as babies were. On the other hand, during this same period, and a mere 20 miles away, my eventually to be second husband, Seam, was rearing his own children, and he and his wife also did not buy toy guns. Seam was an artist and a teacher. His wife was a flautist. And yet their boy Cobus also made swords from sticks and guns from Lego. Meanwhile, it was only when my daughters took a turn playing with the Ninja Turtles that the little plastic mutants got a break from otherwise constant combat and had a chance to chat. Was it just me, or did Raphael and Leonardo seem suspiciously good at verbally exploring relationships? They're boys, said Peter. So I was a young mother, babies draped about my person like small, sticky ornaments on a bent, bedraggled tree. An elderly woman, I thought of them as elderly then, though they were probably younger than I am now. They would gaze reminiscently at me and say, "Oh, enjoy this time. It'll be over before you know it." Clad in the shabby maternity wear I never really had time to put away, my shoulders sporting crusty epaulets of spit up, my breasts the common pawed property of the whole family, and my daily conversation consisting of phrases like, "It hurts the kitty when you bite her tail," and "Yes, you did do a nice job wiping your bum." My early motherhood seemed to be passing with glacial slowness. But those older women were right. The days pass slowly, but the years fly, and in the blink of an eye, my little boys are becoming men. Once small, soft-skinned, and sweet, the boys now wear enormous shoes on hairy feet and loom above my head, and peering upward, I offer advice and remonstrance to their bristling chins, and they make their rebuttals in baritones. I don't think of myself as especially feminine. Indeed, I imagine I'm pretty butch, though that's a self-image mostly derived from childhood, during which friends and relatives were required to call me Kit, as in Carson, or sometimes Keith, as in Partridge. I'm reluctantly muscular-ish, thanks to weightlifting and treadmill running and various other gerbil activities, and I go to work in a male-dominated field clad in a muy macho uniform that the poet Richard Blanco, he's a Mainer, once described as SWAT team pastor wear. My children's mother indeed wears army boots, but I could not be an adequate father figure to them. This wasn't as obvious to me when the kids were small. Zach and Peter were 9 and 7 respectively when their dad died, and his sudden absence from our lives was more a problem of Drew absence in particular rather than father absence more generally. It took a while to recognize that there were deprivations my kids were subject to because they didn't have a father, in addition to the sorrow and deprivation of their own beloved and specific dad. Male relatives, friends, and assorted state troopers were around as they had been around before Drew died, though with a commendably heightened consciousness of how important their presence might be. Deliberately, they would visit, seek out my boys, and talk to them and take them fishing. Once, when dropping Peter off to play with his friend Elias Jenks, I saw Elias's dad greet my son with a big smile and a soft punch and a hug. A large, gentle man, he is also the local Episcopal rector, so it was a man in a clerical collar who met my boy on the threshold. Reverend Jenks would probably have assured me that the father was always with my son, but it was Reverend Jenks himself whom I was grateful for that day. And for my own father, too. In the pink shorts I dressed them in to combat gender stereotypes, and their little Semper Fi t-shirts, Zach and Peter received sandbox lessons on battlefield strategy from my dad, whom they addressed as Morfar, Danish for mother's father. Pipe clenched between his teeth, my father joined his grandsons in the sandbox, and with a bag full of plastic soldiers showed them how to place an artillery battery, or prepare an ambush that would subject the enemy to a blistering enfilade. "Take and hold the high ground if you can, lads," Morfar would say, "and guard your flanks." Violence and sex are two areas that often make the single motherhood of boys especially difficult. Drew had explained sex to his son so comprehensively before he died that I really didn't need to contribute anything to their sex education other than a few repressive hisses when they demonstrated their impressive command of the details in public. Knowing that Drew had already covered this territory was very helpful, as I tend to be puritanical and squeamish about such things. And it wasn't just because they were boys. I wasn't really a whole lot better when it came to talking about sex with my daughters. Though, as my daughter Wooly points out appreciatively, at least I didn't try to persuade them that menstruation is beautiful. But one winter day when Zach was about 14, I was driving him to a guitar lesson and forcing him to listen to the Capitol Steps New Year's Eve comedy on NPR. Zach was not enjoying this. He wasn't enjoying much of anything, really, because he was 14. Scowling darkly at the winter sky, he was wishing he was somewhere else, throwing rocks at something maybe, or feeling up a girl. But he started laughing when Lurdy Dies came on. So Lurdy Dies is a routine that consists of political commentary delivered in spoonerisms. So you whip your flirts. And this one was about Clill Binton, who had gotten into trig bubble. Clill Binton had an affair with Lonica Lewinsky. The president tondled her fitties. So in no time, my son, Brax Ziffith, and I were laughing so hard that I had to pull over onto the verge where we could giggle and snuff-awe in safety. So did a shared cackle at sexual innuendo count as effective parent-child communication? Was cultivating the knock and wait habit before walking into my boys' bedrooms, or tactfully averting my eyes from any magazines that might be stashed beneath the mattress, an adequate substitute for a frank chat? In Denmark, where whole families frolic bollock naked on the beach, my Danish cousins would congratulate their sons when male secondary sex characteristics became evident. Not me. Peter began wearing his pants slung down around his hips, and when I objected, declared that this was so he could show off the hair that had begun to sprout beneath his belly button. "It's my happy trail, Mom Dude," he declared. The problem isn't seeing the trail, it's glimpsing the destination. Get a belt. But then came the day when Zach came staggering in from the backyard, howling, "Oh, oh, oh! What is it? What's wrong?" "My balls, Mom, something's wrong with my balls." You mean your testicles? Well, did you fall on something or something? "I don't know, they just started hurting. Ow, 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 Mom, it hurts." Okay, Even I know this much about testicles. The things are ridiculously delicate. They make you wonder why a designer intelligent enough to tuck the ovaries behind a wall of muscle and fat decided to just dangle those gormless pads out in the air, so vulnerable that male soccer players have to fold their hands across their crotches when guarding the goal from a PK. And even when my little boys were on the t-ball team, they had to wear a cup. But balls don't just spontaneously excruciate, do they? Sweetie, do you want me to take a look? And Zach dropped his trousers. When a 15-year-old boy is willing to show his mom his junk, it's bad. Without bothering to look, I took him to the emergency room. En route to the experts, I stopped wondering what was causing the problem and began considering the process of diagnosis. Honey bunny. Yeah? Zach was curled in semi-fetal position in the passenger seat, emitting the occasional cry when we went over a bump. Honey, when we get to the ER, the doctor is going to have to, how shall I put this? He, or possibly she, is going to have to look at your, oh my God, Mom! Well, and he'll have to tondle your festivals. There was a silence, and then Zach started to giggle. And then we were both snickering and guffawing all the way to the emergency room door. So FYI, moms of boys, it turns out that beneath what the doctor referred to as a tough membrane called the tunica albuginea, which is not nearly tough enough, all the testicles are full of fiddly tubes and cords and whatnot, and all of these are prone to catastrophic kinks. The sudden onset of testicular pain should indeed be considered a medical emergency because it could signal a testicular torsion of the spermatic cord from which the testicle is suspended. There will be a test. If that gets twisted, the blood supply can be interrupted, leading to tissue death and the need for amputation. Zach, fortunately, was merely suffering torsion of the testicular appendix. It can be treated with analgesics and rest, said the doctor, as it will likely resolve itself. But in order to arrive at this diagnosis, the doctor, male, and the nurse, female, did indeed have to extensively examine Zach's intimate tackle. And they handed him off to a fetching ultrasound technician named Cindy, whose examination began with a liberal blob of warm KY jelly. Not all bad then, was my comment as we drove home. It was sort of fun in a way. Quite an evening. Yep, he said everybody tondled my festivals, and Cindy pondled my penis too. As the eldest, Zach would be the first to launch from the familial nest into what I still determinedly thought of as adulthood rather than manhood. As he progressed through high school, the focus of my maternal anxiety began to shift from present to future. What if my darling special boy wasn't accepted to the college of his choice? What if, having matriculated, he not only failed to make the dean's list, but actually flunked? Even assuming some measure of academic success, could his studies prepare him for that good job or graduate school? And those halcyon years immerse a young person in a sea of demographically suitable potential spouses. Would Zach fall in love with yet another arts and letters type? Or might he find a girl whose scores on the math portion of the SATs promised a little numerate DNA to freshen the mix in the family gene pool? But then one fine winter afternoon, Zach arrived home from school with interesting news. We had a career day at school, and I talked to the military recruiters, he said. Now, Zach was a gangly junior with the rest of that year and another after that before his graduation. There was plenty of time for him to make other plans, and it wasn't as if there was a draft to dodge. Besides, the notion that Zach, of all people, might want to be a soldier was laughable. When the neighborhood kids organized wiffle ball games, Zach was the one who argued for extra strikes for the small and klutzy. He wasn't an athlete. He avoided killing anything, even insects. And I was only paying partial attention to what Zach was saying anyway, because the mother of a drowning victim had called that day, and she was having a rotten new year. And the call concluded with her still in tears. So I was going to call her back just as soon as I recalled the formula for predicting whether and when a drowned body will come up on its own, if only so I could provide her with something approaching useful information. So an Army guy and a Navy guy and a Marine are coming to visit me at home, said Zach. Because I'm not 18 yet, they will need a parent to be present. Oh, I'll be present, I said. Don't worry. But because I do remember the precise position of my son's hand on the door of the fridge and the angle of his head as he peered into the fruit drawer where the apples were kept, I must somehow have felt fear. For fear is what can etch such small details so sharply into memory. I said something like, and Zach ate his apple. An all-volunteer force makes enlistment a personal decision rather than a public duty. Like young widowhood or a child predeceasing a parent, donning a uniform, taking up a weapon, and setting off for war represent a once common parting that modern Americans have the luxury of finding strange or even unnatural. But it isn't unnatural, not by the evidence of history. In every human culture, it is a transition marked and recognized, wherein the boy seeks to join the company of warriors, and in so doing also and thereby severs the cord that has bound him to his mother as he enters the world of men. When olden days cartographers found the limits of their knowledge, they left a blank space on their maps, inscribed simply, Hic sunt dracones. My son was thinking of joining the military at a time when American forces were involved in 2 wars, neither of which were going particularly well. On my maternal mental map, therefore, a similar blank space opened, for here, undoubtedly, were dragons. So my son did join the Marine Corps, say, and served from 2004 to 2012. Thank you. As he would be the first to tell you, he never actually had to go into combat. So when people thank him for his service, he'll joke that they'll be thanking him for being yelled at and for responding to mudslides in the Philippines. Good things. As my husband says, leave it to Zach to turn, 8 years in the Marine Corps into the Peace Corps kind of experience. That's my boy. This book I really think of as a book about this very strange period in parenting that I at least didn't have any, couldn't find any books on. And my default mode is whenever something happens, you find books, right? You all understand this. Yeah, okay. You find a bunch of books and you do research, and that's what I did about childbearing, which is why my children were having, the boys had to wear pink shirts and stuff. That all came out of books. So, but there really weren't a lot of books about what happens between 18 and around 25. And it's a very distinct period in human life. It's a real, I think there's a big developmental jump there. I think there's certainly a big social jump. And it reminds me of the terrible twos, right? It's like when a toddler goes from being a toddler to being a preschooler, there's that weird phase in there where they don't know what they are and they can be really disagreeable and all of that. Well, that was sort of how I saw or came to see that last phase of sort of adolescent becoming an adult. And it started with Zach. Well, we had 6 kids, so by the time between us, my second husband and I had 6 kids. And so between us, we got to watch, 6 people do this transition. And of course, in that irritating human way, they each did it completely differently from before. So, but I will tell you actually that the interesting thing about having Zach join the Marine Corps and having him go first was how clear the transition was. So if your kid goes to college, as we found out 5 times. If your kid goes to college, you know, you drive them to college, and then with all your, you know, the station wagon full of junk, and then you get there and you load up the stuff, you know, you carry the stuff up to the 4th floor dorm room that they're always in, and then, you know, you say tearful goodbyes, and then you sort of weepily leave, and, you know, you get out as far as, you know, 295, and you get a phone call saying, I forgot my shampoo. When I come back. So this is not what happens with the Marine Corps. With the Marine Corps, the recruiter comes to your house to pick up your child, and he gets into the car with Marine Corps dude, Sergeant Sangster, rhymes with gangster, and he's gone. And he is gone. When by the time he finally arrived at Camp Pendleton, you know, you get a phone call that says, recruit Griffith, I have arrived at training center, blah, 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 click. That's it. And they each get the same thing. They read it off a card, right? So of course I'm, you know, going, I love you. And then he's gone. There's another few weeks goes by, during which I, for one, was, you know, fretting and yelling at him. And I finally get you get a little postcard. They're all like, you know, it was like, one of the kids said it was like a Mad Lib, because there's a little space at the bottom for free thought, but most of it was, you know, dear blank, I am at blank. This is, you know, my number, this is my address, blank, like there are all these blanks. So, you know, you can fill them in with nouns and adjectives and verbs and then read it back, and it's really funny. And he had filled it in, and basically in his free space he wrote, Mom, it's really fun here, love Zach. You know, it was at that moment that I thought, I don't understand men at all. So, except now my daughter's doing the same thing. So, but anyway, it was such a, he was so clearly not mine anymore, and that he had so clearly gone into an environment that was not about him. And when you're raising your children, anybody who helps you do that, any teachers, any daycare providers, any babysitters, whatever, at least try to make a good show of being extremely interested in the well-being of your child. Right? The Marines they don't do that. It is absolutely not about him at all. It is completely about the mission, and that turned out to be, I realized, a kind of forced introduction into what it actually means to be an adult. You know, when you're an adult, the difference between a child and an adult is that an adult serves. An adult does, you know, takes care of other people instead of always being taken care of. So all of the kids had to kind of find their way into that place, into that role. And some, it definitely takes longer when you send them to college. But it was good for us, I think, all of us, including the kids themselves, to have as an image, you know, their 19-year-old brother, who not only were there no safe spaces, you know, no trigger warnings except for the obvious keep your finger off the trigger warnings. There was, you know, I mean, he would walk in to talk to the commander would order him in, and the commander would say, Griffith, I need you to be in Guam in 2 days. With no, like, and then you go to this website, and then you call this person, and then we'll help you with it. It was just, you had to be in Guam in 2 days. And he was 19 years old, and he would get himself to Guam in 2 days. So for the other children to see that, especially his brothers, was actually really salutary. It was actually good for them. Like, that's the target, is I'm going to be a man. Are there any questions about that?
What did he do when he got out?
Well, now he's, he went back to school. He's finishing his degree, and he has published a book called, it's a book about a group of Maine National Guardsmen who were sent to Iraq in 2004, and they were stationed, even though they were actually a mortar battalion, but these things were a little screwed up. They got sent as guards to Abu Ghraib, and they arrived at Abu Ghraib to replace the West Virginia group, and that was the ones that had the people who took the pictures and all of that. Okay, they left. this group of Mainers comes in just in time to sort of reap the whirlwind. And so they had a year during which Abu Ghraib was incredibly dangerous. It was the most frequently attacked forward operating base of the theater at the time. And they somehow had to create an acceptably safe detainee, what do they call it? Detainee operation, I guess, out of nothing. So it's a really, and they did. So to me, it's a story really about what it means to love your neighbor, like what that actually has to look like, because they pulled it off. It's a book about Mainers, but probably New Englanders at war, because they had that same quality. Like when they had to build something, they would go out and find stuff to build with, including like making their own hammers. And it was that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of ingenuity in it. And it was about community, because National Guard troops aren't selected from all over the place and put together. They tend to be, they were all from Maine. They knew each other, knew each other's families, and they were as old as, the oldest was 40 and the youngest was 19, so they kind of had this spread. There was a father-son duo in the unit. So anyway, I recommend that very highly. So he did that, and he's still finishing up his degree because it took a little while to write the book. And he's doing stand-up comedy. So you can actually go hear him. And he's writing a book with his brother called What Mom Didn't Know. Which I actually think is such a great idea. So the shtick will be that I will never read that book.
I think they're getting you back for some of the stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, my daughter Ellie said at some point, when she was, I don't know, 17 or 19, she said, I'm going to write a book and it's going to be called She Was Not Here When I Needed Her. She hasn't done it yet.
Hey, can you talk about that book in particular?
Yeah, so this was the first book I wrote, and it basically it is a memoir of a span of about 10 years between when my first husband Drew, who was a state trooper, was killed in the line of duty, and the kids and I, we had 4 children. Zach was 9 and the youngest was 3, so they were in there, and so. It's about that, but really it's about, for me, it's about figuring out what to do with and how to maintain the relationship with the love that I experienced as a primary sort of quality of my grief, which I didn't expect. So it was, losing him, of course, was excruciating, but. And being single mother of 4 is not a good thing. I don't recommend that to anyone. That the kids survived at all is largely, down to dominoes. Because Drew was the cook, right? So, but it's really about sort of figuring out what do you do with this love. The love that I had for Drew, the love that Drew had for his community that he served. He had actually been planning to go to seminary and become a minister himself, a Unitarian minister. He would have been such a good minister. But, and because of that, he and I had conversations you never really have unless somebody in your family announces that they're going to become, a religious person. And at that point, discussions ensue. And they were not, I don't think at the beginning, I don't think that I was particularly understanding at first, but over that year, it meant that we've had all these conversations that normally I don't think 30-ish people necessarily have about death and dying, which he had lots of experience of as a trooper, and about why bad things happen to good people and why the innocent suffer, which he had lots of experience of as a trooper. And I actually found out when I went to seminary that the transition from law enforcement to ministry isn't that uncommon. That there were, during the time I was there were at least 5 former police officers, retired police officers who went into the ministry. And for much the same reason, that they had seen so much suffering, and they had kind of tried to address it in this way, and then they figured, okay, maybe I can come at it in a different way. But the upshot really was that I had a path to follow. He had laid, that there were like pamphlets about the Bangor Theological Seminary all around the house and admissions forms and stuff. And I thought, all right, this is, clearly I have to do something with this, and this is what I'm going to do. So I went to seminary, which is awesome. Highly recommend seminary. It's like the best graduate school ever because everything's relevant. God, right? So everything that you're interested in is relevant, and there's no math. I loved it. So anyway, so it's a little bit about seminary, but somewhere in there, I had assumed that I would be a law enforcement chaplain. I mean, I knew that. I thought I would be a chaplain for the state police or a municipal agency or something. I designed my own program, which the seminary was really nice about letting me do, and it involved a lot of ride-alongs. So, I did ride-alongs with NYPD and Philadelphia PD and Pennsylvania State Police and San Francisco PD. Every police department I could get hold of. And it's amazing. You walk in like, hi, I'm a law enforcement widow. And they just do whatever you want. So they would take me on these, some of them were pretty wild and most of them were, pretty boring from a TV point of view, but really interesting. And so I had been going in that direction, and we're not entirely sure how this happened or how I came up on the radar, but at some point I got a call from Lieutenant Allen at the Warden Service, and he has this very deep, kind of Old Testament prophet kind of voice. So I remember, I pick up the phone, and he said, this is Bill Allen, Maine Warden Service. We wanted to know if you'd be interested in being our chaplain. And, like, all the bushes in the front yard burst into flames. So I figured, okay. I had no idea what the chaplain of the Warden Service would do. I didn't know. I probably had the same question that most people have when they talk to me, which is, do you bless the moose? And the answer is yes, but it's usually last right. But I said yeah, and it is the best because game wardens in Maine, game wardens do different things in different states. So in New Hampshire, this is also true, by the way, that they do search and rescue operations. So what the wardens envisioned was that when they were investigating a snowmobile accident and fatal, and you had the family, and you had maybe neighbors or friends or traumatized people, that the chaplain would be the person who would go and kind of deal with them and take care of them. Or if we had a drowning, sort of the same thing. That there's often a lag time where we're finding the body and recovering the body. That somebody would be there with the family to comfort them and inform them. So that was sort of their idea about what I would be used for, which I think really indicates something about them. That the game wardens in Maine, I occupy this position, but this is their ministry. I mean, they created it, and they make it happen. The only reason I show up at a scene is because they call me and say, this is happening. Please, could you get out here? And sometimes they'll even fly me in. So this is really their. I kind of embody it in a uniformed person with chaplain written all over it in big font. Mostly so no one thinks I can do anything really useful. But I represent them. I represent their compassion and their love and their care in a way that they will do if I'm not there. It just is really nice for them if I am. So I do that, and then I also provide pastoral care to them because this is hard work. You get exposed to a lot of loss and death and grief in ways that aren't always, that people don't always think of. But, and so I also will do, basically, if somebody's having a hard time, I go ride around in the truck with them, which is great. I also head up and now train the critical incident stress management team. I got enough training to be the trainer. So we have a peer team that does debriefings after really awful events, really unusually awful events, by law enforcement standards. By civilian standards, they'd all be awful, and we'd be doing it every week. But if it exceeds that threshold, so anyway, it's about that. It's mostly stories about these encounters with people and game wardens and animals in the Maine woods, and it has been, it does not feel like 17 years. So I could easily, Lord willing, and my hips don't give out or whatever, see myself doing it another 17 years, just because it feels that good. But there are game wardens who are now experienced game wardens who've never been on the warden service that didn't have a chaplain, right? Their whole career there's been a chaplain, which is kind of a cool thing. And I've seen there have been babies that I blessed when they were little teenies, and now they're graduating from high school and things like that. So that part is really fun.
It's a beautiful book. I've read it.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
What do you do for yourself? Do you break?
What do I do for myself?
Refreshing your.
I don't need that because I'm a helper. I'm not a helpee.
Yeah.
I'm superhuman, so it's not a no. Actually, it's funny because people ask me that, which is so nice of them to ask, and of course that's always my response. Is like, oh, yeah. But the real answer is my husband takes care of me. He is. I mean,
What does he do?
he's an artist, so yeah, which helps a lot actually, because there are law enforcement families where both people work in law enforcement or first responder families or whatever, but that's a lot of weight. So if you have somebody who actually hasn't been dealing with dead bodies and sad people all day, that it actually is helpful to be able to walk in and he is a cook. I mean, I got lucky twice. Okay? He cooks. He is kind of because we don't have small children too. He's not all sort of burned out on nurturing when I walk in. So he's very sort of understanding and nudges me to do the things you're supposed to do, like go for a walk, or, not just sit in front of the computer and type all day, which otherwise I would do.
What are your other two books about?
Well, let's see.
That last one's title really.
Is that a good title? Marriage and Other Acts of Charity. Well, what happened with that book was, Here If You Need Me, I really thought when I wrote it, I thought it would probably get published because I published a novel like a long time before, so I know that happens, right? But I really thought it would be a regional thing, that maybe Mainers might read it or they'd sell it at LL Bean or something like that. You guys might have gotten around to getting it or something, but it turned out to be a really big deal. And it was a bestseller, and so I went around all over the place. Way further than I thought I would. Went around the country and would give these talks, like this, but a lot more then. And one of the things that I started to realize was that people read that book and assumed that Drew and I had somehow had this magic, perfect relationship. And it started to actually bother me. I felt like I told a lie. And that it wasn't really very helpful because the idea that, that a couple who have 4 small children in a very short time, and one of them is a state trooper, the notion that we somehow have this blissful, stress-free life is just stupid. It's just crazy. And so I thought, and I also started to realize that working through some of the stuff, I laugh about sort of my feminist ideology stuff that I brought in, but actually, believe it or not, it caused a lot of problems in our marriage because Drew was doing all the cooking. It turned out he did all the vacuuming in our house, and I know that because after he died, I went to change the bag in the vacuum cleaner and realized I didn't know how to do it. And we'd had the thing 10 years. All right, so, he did the cooking, he did a lot of housework, he did a lot of childcare because his schedule was weird, so he could, be around during the day. He earned all the money, and I complained that I was oppressed. So, and that lesson, I managed to convince him because I'm very verbal, so very persuasive. So we actually had this, we had some big issues in there that, and we had to learn how to love each other. And since I believe, my theology, the longer I live, gets simpler and simpler, which is basically God is love. And that means that we're here to figure out how to love each other as much as we can, as abundantly as we can, as completely as we can, as generously as we can. And I actually had to learn that. The first lesson was learning how to love my husband. So marriage and other acts of charity is actually about that, about learning how to do what seems like it should be a really simple thing, is just love the person that you love. It's a lot easier to love strangers. I mean, I was Lady Bountiful when it came to strangers, but but Drew not so much. So, so having learned by the grace of God, we learned how to do that. And my son Zach, who was old enough at the time to notice, he actually remembers going from mom and dad used to fight all the time to mom and dad never fight. I mean, that's a vivid memory for him, and that is the last year, as it turned out, of Drew's life. And so that all could have been a lot harder. I mean, it could have been, as it turns, like the last words I said to Drew were, "We adore you." He was leaving the house, and I said, "We adore you." And it could have been like, "Get some milk on the way home," or something. It could have been anything. But there was a time when it could have been, I mean, it could have been like that. So, because a lot of mornings began that way. So, to me, that was such a miracle that I could at least look back and know that that I had been good to him, that we learned how to be good to each other. So it's sort of about that, and then of course, I have to bring in the stories from much more interesting dimensions of life, which is game wardens and animals and outdoor stuff. So that's that one, and then Beginner's Grace was because somebody, so I decided, okay, so I had 2 books, and they had both done pretty well, and I go down to New York, and to be part of a marketing meeting. So I'm in this room, and there are all these people. You know how people from New York look like? They have really elegant, like big jewelry. So there are all these people like that sitting around, and they're all talking about, "Oh, we should." And I bring my knitting because I don't know anything about any of this. So I'm sitting there with my knitting, looking pretty much like this. And one of the women said, "Well, what's Kate going to write next?" And they're all talking, and then finally my editor said, she'll write a book about prayer. And they're all like, "Yeah." And I'm going, "Prayer?" So Beginner's Grace was my book about prayer. And I realized that until I got to seminary, I'd never prayed. And even at seminary, everybody seemed to already understand like why you would do such a thing. So the people who really taught me what it is when you're praying are the mourners I encountered in the field, because they would ask me to pray with them, and I would do it. And so they really taught me what that is. So I thought, okay, this is useful. So I wrote about prayer, basically, specifically for people who were maybe like me, who just are like, have no idea why that would be a good thing. And so what I heard back was nice, which was there were some people who read it and liked it as like, "Oh, I can do this," but there were other people who read it and would say, "Okay, at least now I understand what my religious relatives are doing," or which is good, right? That's a good thing. So that's what that's about, and then there's Anchor and Flares. So unfortunately, my children are starting to write their own books, so I can't really exploit them anymore. Well, that's the question. Yeah, and that's actually been pretty. My editor and my agent have been putting a lot of pressure on me lately because they're like, "It's time for another book." And I don't quite know, because what I've been thinking about lately isn't really what they want me to write about. So we'll see. It's been a very rough few years for law enforcement in the United States, and that has been really hard. I mean, it's been really hard for me, and it's been really hard for the kids as well as for the officers that we know, because all of their cousins and aunts and uncles and my siblings and everybody sort of got caught up in the idea that police officers all over the country are killing people. And, on purpose and that sort of thing. And being pretty open about it on Facebook and whatnot. So, and I went to the funerals in Dallas after the Dallas officers were murdered, and then a week later I went to the funerals in Baton Rouge when they were murdered, and it started to feel like, this group that I love is under attack. I mean, which is not really what my editor and agent would want me to write about. So, and it takes time anyway to know what to say about something like that. So, and it's pretty consuming while it's going on too. I mean, it required a lot of ministry in a way that was different. And it's getting a little better. So, and I go around the country and do a lot of speaking to law enforcement groups about death notification and how people grieve and how you look after grieving people out in the world. And which means I'm always talking to police officers who are eagerly asking, how can we be more loving? How can we be more kind? How can we, sort of go from there to, all they want to do is kill black people is tough. But anyway, it's getting better, and so my next book may be a manual for law enforcement on bereavement support, but probably not going to be a bestseller. But, yeah.
How did you start writing way back? I mean, what did you always want to be a writer? How did
Yeah, I actually remember learning to write when I was 3. So, but my family has a lot of writers in it. I think of it as kind of like if, how doctors often have children who grow up to be doctors, and cops have children who grow up to be cops. So I think there's a lot of that in it. I think if you have a parent, my dad was a combat correspondent, and then he was a historian of how the press and military relations. So I was kind of used to, I grew up in a house where dad's always banging away on the typewriter, and then mom wrote a book, people wrote books, so that part was normal for me. And then I did write a book. It was accepted for publication. It was a novel, and they did actually publish it, and I think they printed 5,000 copies, and I think my mom has 4,000. Hush! I was very young. Yeah. But anyway, so it was
I think
something.
BookBub has something.
Would you stop? Yeah, no, you can still get it, but yeah. But anyway, so that was sort of normal. And I actually remember after Drew died, like not writing anything down for 16 days. And that was significant because I would not have gone 16 minutes without writing something down before. But I knew if I wrote something down, I would have to write down that Drew was dead, and that would make it real, right? So I'm very, very text oriented, and which has its plus and minuses. But yeah,
Could you talk to us a little bit about your process of writing? How you start, and do you know how it's going to end? Is it all in your head before you sit down?
it isn't all in my head, but something's in my head because my husband says, because our studios are right next to each other, he gets really annoyed because when he has to write something, it's this kind of prolonged agony, and he has to walk around all this stuff. He says that I come in, I sit down, and tick, 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 and then eventually he'll go, Kate, you want some coffee? Yeah, okay, tick, 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 tick. And then it's like, hey, we have to go eat lunch. Okay, and then I stop. And there's no downtime. No writer's block or whatever. So, but I think what trained me in that was when I had little kids, which I did for a very long time. And I actually remember with my son Zach, so he was my first baby, and I remember that when he got kind of on a sleeping schedule, that I would be nursing him. I would drink a cup of coffee. I'd put him to bed because his dad was out, night shift. So I put him to bed, and I knew that I had from there until midnight. That was free, and I would write until midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, and then I would go to bed and I'd wake up at 6:30 because that's when the baby had to get out. and we would nurse again, and then I'd drink some more coffee because, you know, I hadn't gotten that much sleep, and then I would do it again, and do it again, and of course, eventually you get enough caffeine in you that it's going into the baby, so that kind of sabotaged. I had really irritable children, but I think what it did was it trained me to know that, you know, if this is the time you have, you use it. And so I still have this kind of herky-jerky life, right? Because I get called out to things, or I have, you know, it's never the same thing or the same schedule. So if I have time to write, I sit down and write. And I'm pretty oblivious to everything else. And then the pager, well, it used to be a pager, now the cell phone rings, and, you know, okay, we've got this and that, and stop. So it's it's very on-off. It's not like normal writers, I don't think, who have like they do this from 9 to noon, and they revise from 1 to 5 or whatever. It's very scattered. But it seems to work.
It works.
Yeah, I mean, I must be doing something in my head while I'm driving around. That's the only thing. Yeah. When it looks like, this is what I tell, you know, my husband, that what it looks like, all I'm doing is staring into space, knitting. That I'm actually, you know, creating genius. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. So where do you want me? Right here. Okay.